lead off in our list merely for that fact. Okay, so Trevor, when you are ready, you just unmute yourself and I will do a brief introduction. Okay.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay.
Well, am I able to start my video?
Yes.
Okay, it's
absolutely
not letting me start my video right now.
Oh, Addie, is this one of the things where we as moderators have to start the video?
Yes.
Let me
double check that you're.
So Addie can make sure you're on.
Okay.
Okay. Hi, Giovanni. We're glad you're here. Please Teams me or Addie if you have any questions, because we are getting ready to get started.
Sounds great. Thank you. Real quick question. Does the order follow what was listed as the abstracts?
Yes, that's
Perfect.
Basically what we're going to do. So,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Share my poster now.
Okay, so I would say let's give it just a moment before you screen share, Trevor, just because I'll do a little introduction.
Okay.
Yeah. Are we live, Addie?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Hi, welcome everyone. We are so glad you are here this Wednesday morning for the Undergraduate Research Symposium of 2021 for the University of Oregon. We have a wonderful interactive poster session to share with you. Quite a number of students. We have 7 posters. Well, actually, I think 8. Yeah, 7 posters. Sorry. We had this one student who couldn't join us, presenting on the panel title, Physiological, Psychological, and Financial Effects of Learning. So I think you will find this a very interesting session on ways in which we learn through different methods and the impacts that that has. So I'm going to turn it over to our first presenter, Trevor, and he will share a little bit about himself, where he's located in the university, and then launch into his poster. Go take it away, Trevor.
All right. Hello, my name is Trevor Bissert. I'm a senior this year at the University of Oregon, and I'm a psychology major. And so I did my poster presentation as part of the Brain and Memory Lab here on campus. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So I did my presentation on the differential functional connectivity of the anterior and posterior hippocampus. So as a brief introduction, the hippocampus aids in linking and remembering experiences by forming general representations of the world around us. And previous research even suggests that there's a functional specialization between the posterior and anterior hippocampus, such that the posterior hippocampus represents specific memories and the anterior hippocampus represents generalized memories. So if we think of the memory of like a dog, we can think of our generalized memories as like an overall schematic of a dog, so that when we see a dog on a street, we can recognize that it is one and not a cat. And then we can think of specific memories as individual representations of different breeds of dogs. And so our mission in this study was to see if the anterior and posterior hippocampal connections differentially support memory specificity and memory generalization performance on numerous different behavioral tasks. And so individuals completed several different measures of memory specificity and generalization in and out of an fMRI scanner. And so here are some examples of those on the right. And so our first example of a memory generalization task was that participants were shown numerous different faces and asked to categorize them into 3 different families, and were told whether they were right or wrong at first. And during the test portion, they were again shown numerous faces and told to categorize them into 3 different families, but were not told whether they were right or wrong. In the second example, participants were shown different pairs of objects, with some pairs sharing an overlapping object, and were tested on their indirect and direct associations between those objects. So for example, an indirect association would be between the blue truck and the zucchini in this example, because they share the overlapping red bucket, and a direct association would be between the zucchini and the red bucket, since they were paired together during the study portion of the task. And so our first example of memory specificity measurement was that in the study portion of the task, participants were shown 60 images of animals and tools. And then during the test portion, they were again shown those 60 items along with 60 new items, and were asked to recall whether the item was old or new in front of them. And so our final example of our task for memory specificity was that participants were shown word pairs in the study portion, and then during the test portion, they were asked to recall the second word pair in each word pair. And so in order to measure functional connectivity throughout the brain, we looked at the mean signal over time between the posterior and anterior hippocampus in different regions of the brain. And we took the significant overlap between those mean signals and decided which regions were significant connections using that significant overlap. And since our result is ongoing and we have a small sample size, we had preliminary results. And so our predictions were that the anterior and posterior hippocampus would be associated with, be connected to distinct brain regions, and that the anterior hippocampal regions would be associated with memory generalization, and the posterior hippocampal connections would be associated with memory specificity performance. And so our whole brain connectivity analysis revealed exactly what we had hoped, is that our posterior hippocampal connections were distinct here in the blue, and in our anterior hippocampal connections were distinct here in the red. And we had very little overlap in the purple here at the top of the brain. And then so we took the results of our whole brain connectivity analysis, and we looked at which of these significant connections reliably predicted memory generalization or memory specificity performance and the behavioral tasks. And so we actually didn't find any connections that reliably predicted memory specificity performance. So this figure here shows the connections that predicted memory generalization success. And we found that connections of both the anterior and posterior hippocampus reliably predicted memory generalization success. And perhaps one of our most interesting results was that both the posterior and anterior hippocampus's connection to the temporal pole predicted memory generalization success. And this was interesting because the temporal pole is usually involved in semantic and conceptual memory, which does relate to memory generalization, but it was interesting to see that the posterior hippocampus's connection with the temporal pole also predicted memory generalization. And then perhaps our second most interesting result was that the anterior hippocampus's connection with the inferior frontal gyrus predicted memory generalization success. And this was interesting because the inferior frontal gyrus is known to be involved in discriminating between competing and overlapping memories, which has a lot to do with memory specificity. So it's interesting to see here that it was actually related to predicting memory generalization success. And then further, we had different connections with the posterior hippocampus along with the superior frontal gyrus and the middle frontal gyrus that predicted memory generalization. And then there were multiple different connections with the anterior hippocampus that predicted memory generalization. Just a couple of them were the paracingulate gyrus, the juxtapositional lobule cortex, and the supramarginal gyrus. And then again, just to reiterate, we had no connections that reliably predicted memory specificity performance. And so in conclusion, we did find that the posterior and anterior hippocampal regions formed distinct functional connections with very little overlap, as we saw in our whole brain connectivity analysis with very little purple overlap, and that not all of our predictions were confirmed, as both the anterior and posterior hippocampal connections predicted memory generalization performance, and we had no connections that reliably predicted memory specificity performance. And so even though we didn't find any connections that reliably predicted memory specificity performance, that doesn't mean that they don't exist. We just had an ongoing study with a low sample size and a low power. And so had these results been replicated further in a larger sample size with higher power, they probably would or perhaps could find regions that predict memory specificity performance. So thank you for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Trevor. It's really fun to see the posters sort of populate as you go along and help make sense of the study that you've been conducting. Thank you for that.
Of course.
Again, folks who are watching, please drop questions you have into the Q&A on the Zoom webinar, and Trevor can respond to you. Oh, I'm getting a message. My internet is unstable, so you may not have heard that. Please drop questions into the Q&A because Trevor wants to respond to any that you have, and we can also answer live questions after everyone's presented. So I'm going to now turn it over to Jennifer and Madeline.
Good morning. Okay, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Madeline Smith, and I'm in the Oregon Education Science Lab.
And I'm Jennifer Vung. I'm also in the Oregon Education Lab.
Okay, So we are so excited to share our research with you today, and we have been studying student motivation and future thinking in an introductory science class. So prior research has shown that when students have learning goals rather than performance goals, are confident in a course, and understand the value of the course for their future, they are more likely to engage in self-regulated learning. Now, prior studies have looked at these variables singularly to see how one factor can relate to self-regulation. However, it may be a more accurate approach to see how these variables work together to form patterns of relations in motivation and self-regulated learning.
So we had two research questions within our study, and the first one was, what motivational and self-regulated learning profiles do students adopt in a required science course? And our second question was, does performance in a science class differ by profile? Our participants were recruited from an introductory science course at a four-year university and completed a self-report questionnaire on their future thinking, goals, confidence, self-regulation, and knowledge-building strategies. And the survey included measures of self-efficacy, perceptions of instrumentality, goals orientation, and self-regulation strategies. For performance, they were measured by their final term grades.
We used hierarchical cluster analysis to find what distinct profiles students adopt in a science course. These clusters represent motivational and self-regulated learning profiles. And what we ended up doing is we used hierarchical cluster analysis to create a dendrogram and icicle plot using Bohr's method and squared Euclidean distance. Looking at the dendrogram, we could see that there were three distinct clusters that best represented our data. This also mirrored prior research findings. The first cluster is the graph in blue. You notice here that the students in this cluster had high performance approach and avoid goals, and they also had high exogenous perception of instrumentality. This indicated to us that these students are really motivated by performance outcomes. So the 25% of the class that's in this cluster are generally in this class to get a good grade, and that's their present motivation. The second cluster, which is the red graph, represents students who have really kind of low scores in all of the variables except exogenous perception of instrumentality. So we can infer from this that these students are less motivated to really learn and understand the material, and they're really just thinking about how they have to get through this class. The final cluster is the third profile of students. This is 40% of the students from the introductory science class. And these students have high mastery goals. They feel very confident about their ability to do well. They're engaging in self-regulation and knowledge building strategies. And you can see that they're much lower in the performance approach and avoid goals and that exogenous perception of instrumentality. This indicates to us that these students are in the class because they want to learn, they're personally interested and invested in this course for their future. We then conducted a one-way ANOVA to see if the end of term grades differed by profile. We found that there was a significant difference between the third cluster students, those who really are just interested and invested in the class, and the first and second cluster students. So while you may think that students in the first cluster who are highly motivated to get a good grade would perform just as well as cluster 3 students, you'll see that in fact that wasn't the case, which we can infer that this may be that the emphasis on doing well ended up hurting their desire to engage in mastery goals.
Overall, we found that a myriad of factors work in tandem to support students' learning and their performance. By using our cluster analysis, we were able to identify the relations between the variables and had 3 motivational and self-regulated learning profiles found. Cluster 1 and 3 are similar, as we mentioned before, which indicates that cluster 3 is better for students' grades. While both clusters have students who are confident and utilizing self-regulation strategies, the difference in performance goals and exogenous perception of instrumentality may be an indicator of the difference between the end-of-term grades for the 2 clusters. By understanding the different learning profiles, students can help secondary science instructors alter the course structure to decrease the emphasis on performance goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer and Madeline. That was really wonderful. I always love hearing how students are motivated or not in classes and what I, as a faculty member, and my colleagues can do better. So this is important to know. Thank you. Moving from thinking about memory and then on to thinking about our motivation for learning in classrooms, we're going to move to Alma. And Alma has a couple of things to be sharing with us. So Alma, if you could please introduce yourself, where you're located in the university, and then go ahead with your presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join you today. I really appreciate the team of students who produced this undergraduate research symposium. Without them, we wouldn't have this opportunity. So a really big thank you to those folks. My name is Alma Lugtu. I'm a COCC student, which is Central Oregon Community College. I'm interested in the psychology of personal finance. And the particular research I'm presenting today focused on amortization tables, and they're also called loan tables. I became interested in amortization tables about 20 years ago when I graduated from law school with about $65,000 in student loans. In today's dollars, that would be about $117,000. When you graduate with that much student loan debt, the federal government used to give borrowers 30 years to pay back those loans. I ended up paying back the loans more than 21 years early, and I credit the use of amortization tables to help me understand how to do that. Over the past decade, I've been teaching others how to use amortization tables, and they've had similar results, paying off student loans, credit cards, and mortgages early. Since all of this data is anecdotal, I wanted to run an actual experiment to see what would happen if participants were taught about amortization tables. So I'm going to pull up my poster, and let's see if I can do this properly. Okay, hopefully that's there in front of everybody. Okay. So I submitted 2 research posters. The first one was, does teaching amortization tables affect student loan repayment choices? And the second one was, does teaching amortization tables online or face-to-face make a difference? Since I have a limited amount of time today, I'm actually going to focus on one of the posters, which I think is the more interesting question. Does teaching amortization tables affect student loan repayment choices? So for my experiment, I used a sample student loan of $32,000 at 5% interest rate. And that was the average student loan in 2020 and the average interest rate for student loans in 2020. For a loan of this size, borrowers could choose between a 10-year loan repayment period or a 25-year loan repayment period. The 10-year loan period required a monthly payment of $340, while the 25-year period required a monthly payment of $187. I had 30 respondents, and before the amortization table education, participants were split 50-50. So 15 chose $340 a month payment, and the other 15 chose the $187 a month payment. During the education, participants were taught how to understand an amortization table. They were taught how to calculate total interest payments and total payments and total interest payments on the student loan using both of the different repayment periods. So for the 10-year period, the total interest paid was $8,800. And for the 25-year period, the total interest paid was $24,100. After this education, 25 participants chose the $340 monthly payment and 5 chose the $187 payment. And that change in behavior was statistically significant at less than 0.001%. So I am really interested in furthering this research and seeing what else it can be used to teach us and what else we can learn about student repayment options and personal finance choices of consumers. Trevor gave an incredible poster presentation earlier that showed about the brain, and my dream would be to do functional MRIs of students while they learn about personal finance. I think that would be so amazing if I could do something like that. And I really want to thank everyone for giving me the chance to present this today. So thank you.
Thank you, Alma. Yes, I think there are very interesting overlaps between what Trevor shared and what you shared and where this work could go. We do have functioning MRI machines on campus, so come over to Eugene and,
Thank you.
and work with our researchers. Yeah. Yeah, that'd be great. And this is obviously a relevant topic to most, if not all, students at the U of O. So very important to bring to our attention, especially those students who are getting ready to graduate and have to think about starting to repay any of those loans they've taken. So,
Absolutely. I do have one question. Should I read it out loud? Okay,
yes.
So this question is from Andrew Waddell, and the question is, this has some really nice linkages to mindset work. Do you have ideas on how to encourage students to shift into a different profile rather than build a class to fit the student unique profiles? I am not quite sure. Oh, sorry, that was for a previous student.
Great, thanks, Andrea. So let's circle back to that at the end of our session, because this question could potentially relate to other presenters as well, but definitely for Jennifer and Madeline. That'll be great.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, let me check my list here and see who we have next. Oh, Erika. Erika gets to present to us about content overload and its effects on learning. And I'm extra excited Erika's here because she and I work on a committee together. So I'm glad I get to hear from her in a different way. Welcome, Erika.
Hi, I'm Erika. I'm a junior human physiology major. I'm in Professor Sarah Dubrow's lab. So I'm going to be talking about content overload and remote learning during COVID. So traditionally, in-person learning has been considered the best educational format. COVID-19 has completely changed the educational system and how we as a society approach learning. During COVID-19 quarantine, forced remote learning has had mixed results. Despite in-person active learning increasing classroom and learning performance, interviews have shown that many students prefer online classes. This raises the question of what is driving preferences towards online learning. Two factors could be driving the preference towards online learning: agency and choice-induced stress. The increased agency accompanied by online learning to choose when, what, and how much educational content a student sees in one sitting is a possible benefit. However, the increased amount of asynchronous study choices may be detrimental due to content overload, which was first coined in marketing studies. In the context of marketing, studies have shown a content overload or decision paralysis effect. Presenting an individual with too many options causes them to freeze and their later decisions to be less decisive and satisfying. This raises the possibility that content overload in a learning context could have the same detrimental effect. Specifically, content overload may create stress, which at high levels would impact learning mechanisms. These two concepts can be applied to the remote learning college student, an individual who has multiple class assignments due every day and must choose which assignments to work on. Having all assignments available simultaneously may lead to choice-induced stress. I hypothesize that increasing presented workload will have detrimental effects on learning. Furthermore, individuals who prefer remote learning will perform best with larger presented workloads. Individuals who prefer in-person learning will perform best with a structured, condensed, presented workload. To carry out this experiment, I will be using an online format. Subjects will first complete a pretest that assesses their study habits, baseline knowledge, and interest in the topics they will soon be studying. Next, subjects will study 8 topics total. Subjects will be randomly assigned to one of 2 learning conditions, a 2-topic condition or an 8-topic condition. In the 2-topic condition, subjects will be presented 2 topics at a time, always paired, and must choose one to study. Subjects will have 5 minutes to study this topic, and after studying, they will choose again from a new pair of topics with the same time parameters. Topic selection will continue in this paired manner for 8 trials total, and will be followed by a restudy phase of an additional identical 8 trials. The 8-topic condition will be the same, except that all 8 topics at once will be presented, and the subject must choose one to study. Subjects will then complete another round of study in the other learning condition. 24 hours after study, subjects will be assessed with comprehension questions, similar to the format and style of the SAT. Then, subjects will complete a questionnaire reflecting on study habits and preference of online versus in-person learning. To analyze this data, I will compare the average test results of the 2-topic condition and the 8-topic condition using paired t-tests for within-subject analysis. Based on their questionnaires, I will sort subjects into 3 groups: in-person, neutral, and remote learning preference. Preferences will be correlated with overall performance and differences between conditions. It is predicted that overall, increasing topic presentation number will decrease test scores. Students who prefer remote learning will perform best in the 8-topic condition because it allows them to pick from all possible content and make decisions based on their attentional status. This provides students with greater agency over their study habits, including how to space or chunk material. Conversely, students who prefer in-person learning will perform worse when content load is increased, as the content load will induce stress. They will perform best when content selection is more structured and less in number. And I would like to thank Professor Sarah Dubrow of the University of Oregon, Dr. Bjarne Awesome of the University Hospital of Trondheim, Norway, David Hahn of the University of Oregon, and the Dubrow and Hutchinson Labs for making this possible. And also shout out to all the Hula Rel people out there in the audience. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Erika. This is probably the most timely topic that you could have selected, given where we are, even in this exact moment in time. And thank you for doing that work and helping us think about the cognitive spaces in which we are living and working and learning together, and how we care for each other in those spaces. So, thank you. Next, we are turning it to Nicole Mullen. Nicole, if you could share with us where you're located within the university specifically, and then begin your presentation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen now, as it sometimes takes a little sec to set up. But again, my name is Nicole. I am actually a neuroscience major and an ethics minor now, and I'm part of the Clark Honors College, and I was really lucky to get this research through the FIRE grant, which I was super lucky, the first year undergraduate research opportunity. So I wanted to thank that at the offset to make sure I don't forget at the end. And let's see. It looks like it's being a little bit strange with the, let's see. Let's see. Okay. You all can see this fine?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. So like I said, my name is Nicole Mullen, and I am an undergraduate researcher at the University of Oregon, and I worked with Professor Caroline Lundquist, and my research focused on researching philosophy with children teaching methods. And I'm really excited to present this research on philosophy for and with children, which I will call P4WC for the rest of the presentation. First, I'd like to start with major events like the Black Lives Matter movement and COVID-19 catalyze a need for teaching methods that first foster critical thinking and curiosity in K-12 classrooms. And P4WC is an incredible educational tool that can address this need. It is really, really important to note that P4WC is not about teaching the history of philosophy to K-12 students. So we're not trying to get philosophy 101 into your 5th graders classroom. What it is about is nurturing the questions and wonder that children have already. And it's a teaching method I really wish had been in my classrooms as I was growing up. Throughout my research, I asked the questions, first, what is the current state of the P4WC educational tool? And what are its applications in K-12 education in light of major events like the Black Lives Matter movement and COVID-19. It is important to note that my research did change due to COVID-19. I plan to attend conferences and do in-person tests, but these of course were not possible. COVID, however, did offer different opportunities, which was nice in that way. So first, I conducted interviews with more than 20 educators and P4WC instructors from around the world, asking questions about the evolution of P4WC, its origins, current applications, personal experiences teaching with P4WC, and of course, its relevance to major current events. I also looked at current scholarship on P4WC, especially focusing on themes of equity and public responsibility. Finally, I researched applications of P4WC in real world and virtual settings using substantial resources for programs in Hawaii and the University of Washington. So with all of this, with all of my hours of interviews and literature research, I created a database of P4WC info and literature for students, educators, and academics. This literature analysis paired with the hours of interviews that I did informed my creation of 4 distinct discussion curricula, which were geared toward 5th graders, and they focused on the Black Lives Matter and COVID-19 themes. So they looked at themes of personal freedom, the public good, personal responsibility, equity, and power. And those were just the ones that I started with. The kids would bring them in so many different places. It was amazing. I then distributed these curricula as well as the database to a local 4J teacher. Throughout my research, I also worked to define what is P4WC. So P4WC is a student-led discussion facilitation with the goals to nurture wonder, foster critical thinking, and finally just disrupt traditional power dynamics between teacher and student. P4C done well is categorized by a strong in, oops. Let's see. Okay. It's, let's see where I stopped off. Okay, it is, okay, so if you're looking at P4WC, the things that you need for sure are first a intellectually safe community that is aware of the power dynamics in the room. And it needs to be guided by children. Educators can guide with their own thought-provoking questions, but ultimately the discussion should be led by the students. What I thought was really fascinating was in terms of its application in a crisis, most experts thought that it is not particularly important to practice P4WC in light of COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter movements. Instead, P4WC should be a tool that is put into classrooms at all times, because times of crisis are not the only time when a child is questioning. It's just with more kids at home, maybe parents are hearing about them more. These crises, however, do bring up certain themes, and these themes can be powerful jumping off points for philosophical discussion. P4WC could also help children deal with uncertainty and ambiguity, because it simply gives a space for children to talk about their wonders and share these with other kids. However, one would really caution against the characterization of P4WC as a therapeutic method. One more point that I thought was really neat was that educators found that while Zoom can feel kind of sterile and dry and maybe not the right place to have a philosophical discussion. They found that when using tools like breakout rooms or bringing like a show and tell, it really helped kids have a wonderful time talking about these things, and it didn't diminish the richness of the philosophical conversation, which was fascinating. So what I really hope that you get from this research is that first, children are naturally curious, imaginative, and of course capable of philosophical thought. And these tendencies should be nurtured not just when they're in college, but throughout their life. So these and P4WC is an amazing tool that can help this need. And it is even more pressing as us as citizens are asked to think more and more about complex ethical issues. And we should have the tools to practice talking about these when we're young, not just when we get older. Again, I would love to thank all of the people that I worked with and had their time. It was crazy to do all these things over Zoom, but it worked. And thank you, all of you, for being here. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. My daughter was fortunate to participate in some of these prior to COVID and really had an excellent experience in having these types of discussions. So I know the power of this work, and it's fun to see you doing some research on it as well. Thank you for that. Oh, we will turn it over now to Giovanni.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Giovanni Ricci. I'm a junior here at U of O, who's a psych major, and I'm going to be presenting on some research that was gathered from the Developmental Social Biology Lab here in the Department of Psychology. So yeah, give me 1 second. All right, so this is my presentation on adverse childhood experiences and salivary oxytocin in mothers with a history of substance abuse. So oxytocin is a peptide hormone and neuropeptide that is produced by the hypothalamus and released by the pituitary gland. Research has shown oxytocin is involved in regulating various social behaviors, particularly within the maternal-child relationship. These include regulating maternal bonding, parental sensitivity to child distress, the exchange of social cues between a mother and infant, and the facilitation of healthy maternal-child attachment. The role oxytocin plays in pair bonding and attachment has also been shown to reduce the effects trauma has on the brain, which likely increases resilience to traumatic events. However, research has also shown early childhood trauma may impair oxytocin production later in life through negative feedback mechanisms within the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis. Now, despite this growing body of research, the association between salivary oxytocin and early childhood trauma has largely gone unexplored, and salivary oxytocin measures have rarely been used in combination with the Adverse Childhood Experiences Questionnaire, or ACE questionnaire, and there has been little research on this association in the high-risk population of mothers of infants with a history of substance use disorders, or SUDs. So as such, the aim of this pilot study was to examine the association between ACE scores and salivary oxytocin in mothers with a history of SUDs using novel salivary immunoassay that has also recently been developed. So as for participants, they included a small sample of 10 mothers participating in a 6-week infant parenting program for mothers of newborns. All participants were recruited from a local residential treatment facility for mothers with a history of SUDs. Prior to the start of the program, baseline maternal salivary oxytocin was collected using passive drool between 9:30 and 10:30 a.m. to control for daytime oxytocin fluctuations. At the end of the program, participants completed the ACE questionnaire, which is essentially just a 10-item questionnaire commonly used to assess various types of childhood abuse, neglect, and exposure to household dysfunction. After all data was collected, saliva samples were assayed in triplicate using a novel electrochemiluminescence immunoassay method. So results. The results of a Spearman's row correlation found a strong, significant negative correlation between baseline maternal salivary oxytocin and ACE scores which can be seen here in table 2. In other words, as participants' ACE scores increased, indicating more adverse childhood experiences, their baseline salivary oxytocin decreased. So figures 1 and 2 here just show the densities of the participants' ACE scores and baseline oxytocin. However, here on the right in figure 3, you can see that as participants' exposure to adverse childhood experiences increased, their baseline oxytocin decreased. And some of you might have noticed that the effect size was quite strong at negative 0.81. So yes, quite a strong effect size there. So this pilot study supports previous findings showing a negative correlation between early childhood trauma and adult oxytocin production by demonstrating this association using salivary oxytocin measures and the ACE questionnaire specifically. As ACE scores increased, baseline maternal salivary oxytocin decreased, and these variables were highly correlated. These findings also suggest this correlation can be seen in the much less studied population of mothers of infants with a history of SUDs, which is quite understudied in this in the literature. So as for implications, given the previous research on the role oxytocin plays in maternal-child bonding and attachment, these findings suggest impaired oxytocin production due to trauma may be one pathway in which the effects of early childhood adversity can be transmitted to future generations. So for example, if you look at figure 4 over here, kind of shows this idea. Exposure to early childhood adversity likely impairs HPA axis functioning, which decreases oxytocin production later in life. This relationship is specifically what our study focuses on. However, previous research has shown that decreased oxytocin has also been linked to impaired maternal-child bonding and attachment, which acts as both a direct risk factor for adverse childhood experiences and can reduce resilience to traumatic events during childhood. So this decreased oxytocin production may increase the likelihood of adverse childhood experiences, as well as making the effects of trauma more severe in children of mothers with a history of trauma. So overall, this may encourage the continuation of this cycle in new mothers as they progress through life and pass these risk factors on to new generations, with oxytocin acting as one pathway through which this occurs. However, it's really important to keep in mind that the impact trauma has on the body and hormone production is incredibly complex, and there are likely many other factors that also influence this relationship as well. However, these results do suggest oxytocin may be one of the ways trauma can be passed on to new generations. So, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Giovanni. That was very interesting study, and being a mother myself, knowing about the bonding that happens with my own children, I think it's important to be thinking about how we're supporting all mother-child pairs in those ways. Thank you. Jenna, we'll turn to you.
Great. Okay, I'm going to get set up really quick. Let's see. Share my screen.
And while you share, maybe you can tell us where you are in connection to the university.
Yeah, of course. I am a senior and a general science major with my focuses in biology and psychology. And I'm also a Clark Honors College student. And so I received the CHC Mentored Research Program Award, which helped pay me while I did my research process, which was really nice. And I'm just gonna, get this a little bit smaller here. All right. Okay, so I'm going to be presenting on my research, which was investigating the possible benefits of maternal thiamine supplementation for enhancing alertness in infants at risk of thiamine deficiency. And I did this through the Cambodia project at the University of Oregon. And so the main primary investigators are Dr. Dare Baldwin and Jeffrey Mazel through the psychology department. A little bit of an introduction is that thiamine, also known as vitamin B1, is an essential vitamin required for the breakdown of carbohydrates into energy. It also plays a key role in metabolic pathways throughout the body, particularly in the brain, which is keenly dependent on metabolic resources early in development. So due to a number of factors, including a cultural dependence on highly polished rice, millions of Southeast Asian children are at risk for thiamine deficiency. This in turn puts their neurocognitive development in peril, as previous research has shown that inadequate access to thiamine in infancy leads to language and motor impairments early in life. We suspect it also affects other cognitive domains. The study I'll be reporting on was based in Cambodia. There, a sample of 335 mother-infant pairs participated in our double-blind randomized controlled trial. The mothers received one of 4 levels of thiamine supplementation: 0, 1.2, 2.4, or 10 milligrams per day, beginning at 2 weeks postpartum. At 2 weeks, 12 weeks, and 24 weeks, we assessed infant neurobehavioral development. In the case of this study, through the primary engagement task. The PET was designed with the goal of tapping into basic social interaction skills that emerge early in infancy. The task hinges on asking mothers to elicit a smile from their infant while gradually introducing new engagement tools. So in Epic 1, a mother looks completely away from her infant. It's her baseline. In Epic 2, a mother can look at her infant and use her facial expressions to elicit a smile. In Epic 3, she can then use her voice along with her facial expressions. In Epic 4, a mother can add touch. In Epic 5, the mother starts removing engagement tools, so she removes her touch. In Epic 6, a mother removes her voice and only uses her facial expressions. So we did behavioral coding from videos of the primary engagement task to determine changes in infant alertness across the epochs of the PET. And we used a standard clinical assessment called the NICU Network of Neurobehavioral Scale, NNNS for short. So we had predicted that an infant's alertness would increase, then decrease, remaining higher than baseline as mothers added then removed interaction modalities. And our findings confirm this prediction, as is shown by the significant linear and quadratic trends in response across epochs of the PET. This validated our newly designed primary engagement task. We had also predicted that the linear and quadratic patterns would become more pronounced with increasing age. We saw that infants at all ages showed both linear and quadratic trends in response. There were age differences, however, such that infant alertness levels increased from 2 to 12 weeks, and infants at 12 and 24 weeks showed a more pronounced linear trend in their response. Finally, we had predicted that the linear and quadratic patterns would become more pronounced with higher dosages of thiamine supplementation. Against predictions, supplementation was not related to linear and quadratic trends in the primary engagement task. It was, however, related to infant alertness in Epic 1 of the primary engagement task, but it was not in a dose response manner. As is shown, 1.2 milligram supplementation group had a higher baseline alertness in comparison to the 2.4 and 0 milligram group. So we also ran some exploratory analyses to understand more how state was relating to thiamine. And the most interesting finding was that infant Epic 1 state was associated with N-line Mullen scales of early learning in the composite, as well as the receptive language, fine motor, and expressive language subscales, but this was in the negative direction. This means that the lower an infant's baseline state at 2 weeks, the higher their 24-week cognitive outcomes. So the key takeaways of this research. One is that the primary engagement task is a valuable new tool for probing infants' responsiveness to their caregivers' efforts to engage in mutually positive ways. Also, the NICU Network of Neurobehavioral Scale is a valuable long-range predictor of cognitive functioning. And finally, clarity about the precise benefits of maternal thiamine supplementation for infant social alertness awaits further investigation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenna. That's a very interesting study that looks like it has lots of possibilities for forward movement. And I see that we have some questions and or comments in the chat, so I want to make sure we get to those. And then also, as others again who are watching, if you have questions for any of our panelists, please drop those into the Q&A section that you see on the Zoom webinar. And work. So let's see. So I'm going back to the beginning of our questions. And I see that our first question is for Jennifer and Madeline. And so this question says that there were really some nice linkages to mindset work. Do you have ideas on how to encourage students to shift into a different profile based on your, those 3 profiles you had in your study, rather than build a class to fit the student unique profile?
This is a great question, Andrea, and an interesting one in thinking how we frame motivation in educational settings. If you're thinking about students and their motivation and what they can do to, jumpstart themselves if they're feeling amotivated in a class, research has suggested that when students can make connections between what they're doing in the present with future goals, it can support that motivation. But I like to think that this research can challenge, teacher education, and we can think about how instructors can also shift, knowing that students are going to be, there will be some students who are really invested in the course and some who want to do well but are struggling to make that connection to their future and to their personal goals, that instructors can then decrease an emphasis on performance outcomes and support that curiosity, which I know that we listened to earlier today, how important that curiosity in students are.
Jennifer, is there anything you wanted to add to that response?
I think Madeline answered it completely
Okay,
nicely.
I just want to make sure you have the opportunity. So thank you. And then it says from Andrea that there's an amendment to the question to link to all of the students in the group. You're all bringing up great points about the unique profile students may have that can lead to some students being left behind in environments that are overwhelming via cognitive overload or choice overload. So this especially relates to Erika's work. I would love to hear thoughts from the group about how we can empower students to overcome their obstacles and be successful despite the class structures. So these are really great questions that I think especially are connected to some of our first panelists. So I think it connects to Trevor, Jennifer and Madeline, Erika, Nicole, in particular, but I think Giovanni and Jenna may have some responses as well. So anyone, feel free to contribute your ideas here.
Well, I'd say in the remote learning context right now, people who prefer online learning are definitely in the better situation. That you can't just keep on doing what they're doing, whatever works best for them. But for the people who prefer in-person learning that are, learning remotely right now, I would suggest maybe just trying to make a more structured study plan. I don't really know what else they could do because of the remote learning situation, but just maybe really trying to structure things down and reduce the ballooning workload effect, I guess. So don't let things fester.
Julie, if I could offer a thought. My second poster was actually, does teaching amortization tables online or face-to-face make a difference? So it's great that Andrea asked this question and I didn't address it in my short 3 to 5 minutes. What I had found was that face-to-face and online, there's literature that shows that, one is better than the other, or maybe they're equally the same. And it, depends a lot on the circumstances. And from my data, when I tested 9 of the participants face-to-face, and then the rest of them had to be online due to COVID, the results were similar. Face-to-face was a little bit more effective, and all the 3 questions that the participants were asked were all statistically significant, but the education was still effective. So if we were looking for ways to help students overcome obstacles, especially in the remote learning situation, one of the things that I've seen people do, and I'm actually doing this myself through an online group, is reaching out and making sure you have social support. So even though you can't be in the classroom with the students, but if you can find a way online to connect with them, and then create a support structure for yourself, that way you can get some help with am I making sure I'm on task? Am I making sure I'm understanding the information? And in one of my classes last quarter, we actually did online Zoom homework sessions together to make sure that we all understood, we're doing a research methods class and learning all the new calculations, like, binomials and chi-squares and everything. So it was great to sit there and do homework together and say, what did you guys get? And what did you guys get? So that might be something that would help, that despite online, still find ways to connect with each other and create community for yourself.
I think I would add one more thing to that, is that though doing lots of these educational things, we're very used to doing them in person, I think it surprised all of this, the surprising amount of intimacy, I guess can be the word, that you can find on Zoom or any of these platforms, especially with young people. That is one thing that we found, was that, and this is very anecdotal, I would love to do more tests on this, but they found that in groups of kids, I talked to someone who was doing P4WC in Tel Aviv, and he found that with the groups of kids that he worked with, especially the female students, were more likely to talk and to ask questions when they were in the Zoom room rather than in person. And the educator didn't know totally why, but one of the reasons he thought about was because you do have that kind of safety with being in your own place, your own thing, and there wasn't the physical aspect of being in a room with other people and maybe being nervous and being shy, especially with young people. We're so used to this kind of tech. I know I'm not always super used to it, but I mean, if you're like 8, you've never lived in a world where there's no internet or FaceTime and things like that. And so I think that was really fascinating. There are definitely pros and cons. And I think as we go forward from this, we're going to have to balance, how do we keep the benefits of this virtual world, and how do we make sure that we bring back the things that we need from being in a physical space with other people. So definitely so much more research to come on this.
Thank you for that. Anyone else have commentary on this question about empowering students to overcome their obstacles and be successful despite class structures? I think all their recommendations so far have been excellent. Okay, thank you. Giovanni, this is a question specific for you and your research. Have you come across any interventions to help potentially intervene or break this cycle for the parents with trauma?
Yeah, I love this question. I do know that I come across in my research, a big part of the effects early childhood trauma might have on the HPA axis functioning later in life and oxytocin production seem to be through the effects of like chronic stress, exposure to stress over long periods of time, which is shown to impair the HPA axis functioning. And there has been studies showing, looking at, I believe, many kids in like orphanages, and looking at how the impacts chronic stress has had on their HPA axis can actually be reversed with parenting interventions focused on positive parenting with those kids, if those interventions are done earlier in life, under 6 years of age for the kids. So there does seem to be interventions that can kind of get at this relationship, which is very hopeful news for me, at least. But why I think this question is so interesting for me is that the parenting intervention that I mentioned, the participants were actually taking part of in our research, that was a that was trying to like focus on this relationship a little bit, focus on, it was a parenting intervention. So while we didn't really look at the outcomes on the kids per se, we did, not part of this study, the research I talked about was a subset of the data from this study. But we looked at how this parenting intervention affect the mom's rates of like depression and things like that, and like their like parenting outcomes and their confidence with their babies and things like that. So there are interventions that can get at this relationship, and they do show hopeful effects, hopeful signs.
Thank you, Giovanni. That's really great to hear about where we can go with this. And in that regard, not only for Giovanni, but for everyone, I think to hear about perhaps next phases that your research will be taking, and or even if you are not able to continue with it right now, what recommendations you have for future research related to what you have studied and shared with us today. This is the open question for everyone.
I
Great,
can
Nicole.
talk on all of this. So I think P4WC is amazing, and though I am a very different major than what I was before. I am studying neuroscience and ethics, which is a little bit different than education. One thing that it taught me is that this tool is amazing, and I would love to go out and be able to do these kinds of things, not just with children, but with my friends and family. It's just amazing to have a space where you can question, wonder, and share that with other people. I think it is really, really powerful, especially when we're in this kind of chaotic time that we're in. And so my hope for the future is that people keep looking at this as a teaching method that is really powerful for not only kids, but also for the people teaching them. There is this kind of strange power dynamic between student and teacher, where the teacher is really the one who transmits information to the child, where it really should be a two-way thing. Like, I know when I was teaching kids, I was learning so much from them. It made me a better person. And so I hope that that kind of knowledge and methodology like slowly makes its way into our larger education system. But I'm really, really happy so far with things that are going on at the University of Washington. And also there's a really large P4WC program in K through 12 schools in Hawaii, which is amazing. And so I hope to see those programs have more and more success, and hopefully that will go off into a broader group of people and become something we all get to do more often. But yeah.
I love that. Thank you. Giovanni, it looks like you have something to share.
Yeah, in regards to future research, the research I was just presenting on was definitely a pilot study. And so the biggest limitation to it is definitely the very small sample size, right? We only had 10 moms, but we did have like an incredibly large effect size. And so moving forward, we definitely want to look at this relationship with a larger study, larger population. And we do want to introduce kind of like some sort of like parent-infant interaction that we can kind of break down in code and see how ACE scores and oxytocin affect this parenting interaction as well, and kind of get at a little bit more of that relationship of those intergenerational effects. But it's something we're excited about, so thank you.
How about Jenna?
Well, I was going to say first, Giovanni, I wonder, since I know that your PI works very closely with my PI, Jeffrey Mazzell, and I believe they're married. I wonder if you'll use the primary engagement task for infant and mother social interaction.
I'm actually in the process of like looking at different interactions, that to consider for future research. So I'll definitely look into that.
Yeah, cool. But I guess future research, since I was just like a small part of my larger project, we'll be looking at other infant developmental outcomes. We have other behavioral tasks that looked at language. They looked at kind of like more of the like gel coding between mother and infant, like how positive that interaction felt. And so that will come. And then I think I've been really pushing for our lab to do some more cultural considerations around like what these mothers understood of this research, and really like if our kind of like Western behavioral tasks are really appropriate in a country that has different parenting norms. So hoping that we'll get a chance, or at least like more funding, to maybe like be in Cambodia to ask some more qualitative like questions about it.
Yeah, that cultural aspect is a very important one, Jenna. And I hope that research funding and travel, research funding will come through and travel restrictions can be lifted to allow for that. So Erika.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that I'm hoping to start doing some pilot studies next week. So hopefully I'll get some promising data. And as far as what I'd like to get, or like broader impacts from this research are, I'm hoping that if my hypothesis is correct, or like, increasing workload hurts learning, I'm hoping that maybe some educators out there would make an effort to not dump piles of homework on their students, because it's always very stressful. If they, I just hope that they take that into consideration when they assign homework.
Yeah, the applicability of the research that you're doing will be very interesting, right? And so we look forward to hearing even more about the pilots that you're going to be conducting. Alma.
Julie, thanks so much for asking about future research and what can happen going forward. I'm so interested in the topic of student loan debt and personal finance, because I did a little bit of research prior to doing my experiment, my pilot study, and in 2020, student loan debt in the United States was $1.6 trillion. It's shocking how high these numbers have gone. And research has found that these student loan borrowers were more likely to carry other types of debt, such as car loans and credit card debts. What's really significant is that 72% of accounts currently in forbearance or deferral, which means that payments aren't being made on these accounts. It represents about $1.1 trillion worth of paused student loan debt, which is an increase of $584 billion since 2019. So it's really scary to think that there's that much money owed and people aren't paying on it. That could be a huge implications for our economy. So going forward, I'm actually in the process of looking at other types of education for amortization tables and teaching them in different ways. I'm in the process of submitting an IRB through COCC. We don't have as many fun and interesting labs as you all have with functional MRI machines, but maybe someday that can be in my future as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Alma. This is really important work that you're doing to current cultural questions about student loans and just the costs of higher ed in general. So very important times for this research. Trevor, do you have anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, so as far as my study being my study was part of an ongoing study being done by one of the grad students in my lab, and my study was just kind of an offput of that overall study. And so it would be definitely interesting to see how my study plays into her full study at the end when she does her final data analysis. But overall, I think that the implications of my study, or at least like further looking into how the hippocampus relates to memory generalization, I think could have strong implications in how we look at neural representations of like schematics that we form, schemas, and even how memory generalization can be detrimental and perhaps lead to stereotyping and things like that. And so we can kind of see these like neural representations of how stereotypes and maybe discrimination start to form in the brain. And so I think it's kind of interesting to see those implications. And it'd be very interesting to see studies done like mine with larger sample size and maybe different types of behavioral tasks as well that have maybe more real world implications.
Yeah, I think those are all excellent recommendations for next steps, right? The scale and the methodology. And then I think also a great reminder how, research work is not entirely siloed, but connected to the work of others, such as your contribution to the study that the graduate student is conducting.
Yeah, definitely.
That's great. Jennifer and Madeline, anything from you that you'd like to share related to your research and what it might look like in the future?
Yeah, well, situated in the College of Education, I hear about great philosophers like Freire and bell hooks who talk about education as freedom and how can we support students to use education to pursue their goals. And so, there's known research that when trying to pursue STEM careers, there's a lot of barriers for students. And that's why we situated this study in an introductory science course that would be required for any STEM major. So I'd like to look at other science courses and see how do learning profiles that students adopt may differ based on different instructional practices. And I think there's a lot of hope for how science courses are taught to support students' motivation. I'm very fortunate to be part of a project that's conducting an intervention for STEM educators that, is hoping to teach active learning strategies for educators to use to help support student motivation in these introductory science classes.
That's great. And Jennifer, did you want to add there?
Yeah,
I just yeah, great.
I think like additional things like overall in this research of like a future time perspective, like students in the classrooms is just being able to like find research about the motivation and how specifically how their will to like learn and what they're trying to get out from the future research or like future goals are like related to one another. Because I know that's like one thing that our research is trying to see how the different variables that we studied are like all correlated, but also studied separately into like what students' intrinsic motivation.
That motivation for learning and one's investment in one's and engagement in oneself and future in the now is really important as well. And thinking about where how one engages in one's own outcomes is really, really important. So, well, I'm not seeing any additional questions at this point in time. So I think if everyone's okay.
Hope, I think you're cutting out, Julie.
Can you hear me now, Addie?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for that. My internet's usually pretty good, but it's being a little off today. So I was just saying thank you to all of you for sharing your wonderful research today. I think it was Nicole who said something about questioning, wonder, and sharing. And I think that's exactly what this panel represents. And the research that you've conducted over the past year has brought forward questioning, wonder, and sharing, right? And thinking about that for the future as well. So it's been a challenging year in many ways, but you have all come through with really amazing research to share here that will be impactful for the future as well, for your own research as well as for others that is being conducted. And as many of you said, we want to thank the entire undergraduate research symposium committee for their tireless work I know they've been working extremely hard to pull this together, to funders of specific research projects from throughout campus. Thank you for providing the opportunity to support this type of student research, and we look forward to where each of you go next. And please keep us apprised of your work. Take care, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the symposium. So
Thank you
it's
so
good
much.
to see all of you. Oh, thank
Thank
you.
Thank you, Julie.
Yeah.
Bye.
Take care.